Oh, Muhsinah, it's so great to have you here. And Dylan and Jasmine, welcome, welcome. So, yeah, this is, I'm really excited. Dr. Morris, you have been in this event and you've come up multiple times. And this is, we often hear you talking about your work as the leader of the MetaVRsity project at Morehouse College, but I ask you to lead this panel because I know this is a passion area for you. We are also welcoming on your panel today Dylan Fox, who's the coordinator and engagement team lead at XR Access, and Jasmine Clark, who is the digital scholarship librarian from Temple University. Now, we did have a fourth panelist, Anna Xygkou, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Kent. Unfortunately, at the last minute, she could not be here, but she did share a brief video. We're going to bring that on and show that quickly, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, to Muhsinah, for the rest of the panel.
Sounds great. Hello, everybody. My name is Anna Xygkou. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Kent, and I'm carrying out research on immersive technologies and specifically virtual reality with autistic people, autistic populations. My relationship with immersive technologies and autism starts a few years ago when I started my PhD at the University of Kent. My PhD focuses on research on autism and virtual reality and how we can exploit virtual reality with vulnerable groups such as autistic people. The second approach that I had in terms of autism and VR was through an autism VR channel. I founded in Autism Space VR with another 3 academics, and we're running regular monthly sessions up to last year. The way I see virtual reality is as a transcendent tool for those socially challenged groups such as the autistic adults and children. So in this slide, you can see the logo of our Autism VR channel. And here, you can see all the potential we think that a channel like this could have. So by setting up this specific channel, we thought that it could offer a lot of affordances for autistic people. Apart from a space to socialize, it also enhanced their willingness to be creative. It acted as an entertaining, imaginative and imagination space. They could meet with other peers, and also they could collaborate and co-design, even develop virtual worlds. From my experience with autistic adults and people from the autism community in the specific channel, I found out that we needed a bigger support framework in order to be able to achieve what we think we can achieve with virtual reality, and to give those people all the support they need. So it's like this triadic kind of diagram is what summarizes what we need to do. So we need the autistic users' views, yes, and we need to involve them in participatory co-design. We also need the autism community views that has to do with professionals working in the field, such as teachers, academics, psychologists, and also we need the tech side of the VR, the VR community that have all the technical skills to materialize anything we have in mind. So this is not that easy, although I've seen lots of software in virtual reality for autistic people claiming they improve skills. It's not always that easy. The really effective ones have to be made with the collaboration of specialists and professionals. And this is something I need to emphasize and highlight in this in this talk. So we need a framework that can actually support the design, the development of this kind of VR software to support the specific population. So the aspirations are feasible. So we can democratize virtual reality for autistic people, for people who have lots of potential we cannot see. It's locked, and probably for whatever reason, be it social skills deficit, or be it any other type of behavioral shyness, they do not show us what exactly they can do. So we can support a VR platform without any type of barriers for the autism community, and we can empower autistic people and involve them in creating the world they want. So the actual message I'd like to pass along, and I would like this to be a really a point of discussion, if it's possible, is that we can do great things with extended reality software and autistic populations, as long as there is a coordinated collaboration among all parts. And this is the basic thing to achieve effectiveness. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I hope that this is food for thought. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, we thank Anna for sending those thoughts about the autism community and how she's building community and inclusiveness for those who are on the spectrum. I want you to think about a few things. What does an inclusive education look like? After pilfering through all of the alphabet soup that belongs to the world of disabilities, how can you really get it right as an educator? I'm an educator, so I've often thought of these things. These are the things that keep me up at night. As a mom to a son with autism spectrum disorder who has moderate support needs, as a professor who uses innovative technologies to differentiate instruction and to increase student achievement and engagement, I am always an inquiring mind, and I really need to know. I'm a member of the Community Advisory Council and Advocacy Ambassadors for Autism Speaks. Therefore, I advocate heavily in our community and for our higher education students to be accommodated in the ways that they need to be. Today, I am moderating a panel entitled Enabling Different Abilities with XR Content, because immersive learning can unlock potential for those with special needs, whether physical or cognitive impairments. This panel of experts, who I am so humbled to stand beside, will help you to shift your mind into the possibilities that exist for all of us. I am Dr. Muhsinah Morris, Metaversity Director at Morehouse College, Assistant Professor of Education, and CEO of Metaverse United. I would like to talk a little bit about accessibility, because accessibility means many things. And then as we're talking about accessibility, and when I hand off the baton, I want the panelists to introduce themselves in their own work in their own words as they speak about their work. So, Jasmine, accessibility means many things. In your line of work, what does accessibility mean for educators?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So once again, my name is Jasmine Clark. I am the Digital Scholarship Librarian at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For me, accessibility in my work comes in, I would say, two distinct branches, right? As a librarian, in a multidisciplinary, multi-technology space where we have not only XR, but making and high-powered computing and things like that, the whole concept of accessibility plays into the services that I have to provide, making sure that patrons can come in and that patrons with any kind of ability, disability, can come in and provide feedback and try technologies and engage in the space the way that any other patron would. But what I will be focusing on today is my work with instructors in education, which I want to reference back to Anna's kind of point of connecting these these very important, equally important communities.
Mhm.
where you have developers, and I would even divide that too, because accessibility is still extremely specialized for most people. So you have people who are XR developers, accessibility specialists, and some people, the minority that intersect with both of those. You have disabled users, and then you, in the case of education, you have educators who can fall into the disabled user category as well, but who are acting as this intermediate. And my work really fits in that kind of creating a bridge between the extremely technical or familiar with disability and accessibility and educators who have no background in either of those things, who find this really interesting, who want to incorporate XR technologies, but don't necessarily know anything about the technical component, right? They're increasingly prepackaged, ready-to-made things that they can use, and they're not necessarily geared to think about inclusion and accessibility in that. So my work is really about helping educators who have no background in that, and I'll talk about that more, of course, later in the panel. But I want to give Dylan a chance to introduce himself.
Awesome, thanks, Jasmine.
Okay.
So, shall
Good.
I? So, hello everyone. My name is Dylan Fox. I am the coordination and engagement team lead for XR Access. Now, XR Access is a nonprofit based out of Cornell Tech, focused on accessibility for immersive technology. And now that means a whole lot of things, right? Accessibility is a really loaded term, but for us, I think we tend to think about accessibility in two ways. The first is kind of broad accessibility of products and applications. And so that is to say that every single application out there for XR should be usable by as many people with disabilities as possible, right? Things should be usable by everyone. We don't want to have, here are the apps that able-bodied people can use, and then here's the like 3 apps that were made for people with visual disabilities and the 2 apps that were made for people with mobility disabilities. Everything should be usable by as many people as possible. And so to that end, we do a ton of work trying to connect, all of the different stakeholders. Like Jasmine was saying, there's so many people that you need to connect to solve these problems. People with disabilities, content creators, educators, healthcare workers, politicians, just so many stakeholders that need to be on board and talking to each other in order to solve this. And that also applies to the second type of accessibility that we like to think of, which is XR for assistive technology. And so that would be tools and research focused on applying these new technologies that we have to specifically problems that people with disabilities face. So, for example, in addition to working with XR Access, I'm a researcher at UC Berkeley, and we're working on augmented reality for obstacle avoidance for people with visual disabilities, because a lot of these AR devices, for the majority of users, people can see the objects. They don't necessarily need to be told where they are. But for the minority, for the people that can really benefit from knowing where things are, let's think about what's the best way to use that. What's the best way to utilize these technologies to assist people? So I could go on, but I'll pass it back to Muhsinah here to open up the conversation.
I really like the fact that you differentiated between the language that is used to describe accessibility. My son, who has autism, uses assistive technology to help improve his communication, his pragmatic skills, his ability to have these emotive responses. So that is one way that XR is being used. But then there's also like the games like that everybody wants to play, like Beat Saber. You want to play Beat Saber in virtual reality. Well, how do you do that, and how do you make that inclusive so that the person who is blind can also play it, the person who is deafblind, the person that may not be able to communicate or even use the controllers? That is another type of accessibility. So there are many intersections for what accessibility means. So while we talk about those with learning challenges and physical impairments, there's also an accessibility intersection that occurs in schools that are in under-resourced, underprivileged communities. Jasmine, would you like to shed a light on how we can increase access to tech for those students who can also experience disability, yet have no other alternatives or recourse for help?
Sure. So one aspect of my work is I'm building a VR game called the Virtual Bloxen. The Charles L. Bloxen Afro-American Collection is a collection collected by Dr. Bloxen, who was originally from Norristown, a suburb of the Philadelphia area. When he was 9 years old, he asked his history teacher what Negroes had contributed to U.S. history, and she told him nothing. As a result of that, he began collecting everything he could related to the African diaspora. It has become this collection that he donated to Temple University, some of it to Penn State. And I want to teach students in the Philadelphia school system how to do primary source research, particularly in the current political environment, always for us, but particularly in the current environment, it's really important that we know how to research our own history. So this all comes into play where you have to know about the demographics of the Philadelphia school district. Like many urban school districts, but particularly for Philadelphia, Philadelphia is about 50% African American, Black American, you could say. These schools are extremely low income. There's about, I think now 9 libraries for all of the multiple hundreds of school libraries and librarians. And so you have what is an information divide, of course, extremely low income, underfunded schools, decaying buildings, lead in the water. We're talking about what in another country we would just call a slum, right? In many of these areas, decrepit houses. Philadelphia is an old city. Our houses are still around from the 1900s. And I say all of this to say, I want to roll out a VR game that allows students to walk into an archive, experience the process of uncovering. It's like kind of like an escape room puzzle game where they're unlocking Black stories. And they're doing that by doing what is in essence archival research, but gamified. Let's get into how we're going to have to get around that. Well, there's one, you have to think about overcrowded classrooms. How do you bring headsets to a classroom with 30 plus students, kids just running around? You can't. And you have to think about, of course, accessibility. Rates of disability are increased in low-income areas, particularly in African-American populations. African-Americans and Indigenous Americans have the highest rates of disability, even though respectively we're 13% and then 1 to 2% of the population. So that looks a couple of ways. Derek Ham at UNC actually drives around with a van with headsets in the back so that students can play out in their neighborhoods. We have an immersive studio, so we actually host field trips where people can bring whole classrooms to a soundproof studio and they can play with headsets. Teachers don't have to think about it. Kids get to go to a college campus. We also are going to host mobile VR, so kids can play it at home if they'd like to, or without having to have expensive headsets. But a lot of it is going to come down to redistributing resources. We're going to have to say, as a university with money, we work with these teachers and these schools, and we find ways that meet their unique needs, because not every school has the same barriers. And we think about how we can do that, along with user testing for accessibility for disability, which we've been doing for years now. And the game we are experimenting with accessibility measures for this specific game.
Awesome. So, this brings me to another point. We talk a lot about engagement and using XR to differentiate instruction as well. It was interesting because I gave a talk at the American Chemical Society conference, and a blind chemistry student came up to me after my talk and she said, "Oh, wow, this sounds all great, but I'm blind and I'm autistic." And I didn't really have any experience with teaching a student with her types of disabilities. And so I let her tell me her story, and I asked her, "How do you experience the internet?" And what I found is that we have a long way to go just in terms of providing accessibility to the internet. And now we're moving into Web 3.0. We're using XR technologies to teach. And so we have a long way to go. Dylan, you have developed information and guidelines that help us to understand ways in which to make XR inclusive. Can you elaborate on the things that you have put in place?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot, as we said before, there's a lot of people that need to be involved when we're talking about making things accessible. I think first and foremost, for content creators, there's a ton of best practices that you can do to make your app more accessible, right? Things like improving color contrast, making your text bigger, adding captions, making sure that you have um, controls that can be used while seated or standing or lying down, and have other types of flexibility that way. The more accessibility features that you can work into your application, the more people that will have access to it and be able to use it, and the better it's going to be for everybody, whether they're disabled or not.
Absolutely.
So we've captured a lot of the resources that can tell you about how to make your application more accessible at a GitHub that is a combination project between XR Access and the XR Association. I say GitHub, don't worry, it's not all code and jibber jabber. It's very digestible resources, whether you're a content creator or whether you are an educator or a stakeholder, somebody who's maybe choosing which of these systems to purchase for your office or your school.
Cool.
So I don't see a way for me to add these links to the chat myself, but maybe one of our helpers can put them in.
Yes, so
Really
we have those links, and Sophia put them in the chat for us.
fantastic. Yeah, I would really encourage people to take a look at the GitHub, to take a look also the PEAT. PEAT is the Partnership for Employment and Accessible Technology. They made a fantastic guidebook for people who need to think about maybe procuring technology, to make sure that you are buying it and using it accessibly. Because even when the tech itself is accessible, if the people that are using it aren't thinking about things like, how am I going to get sign language interpreters when I need them? Is the content that I'm adding in accessible, right? It really takes a group effort to make sure that this stuff works for everyone and that nobody's getting left out. Um, the biggest thing you can do, of course, is to make sure that you include people with disabilities on your teams, right? As creators, as organizers, as participants. Make sure that you're not just kind of inviting them at the last second and then surprised when they don't show up because it's not accessible, right?
Right.
You really need to be part of the process from the get-go. And the last thing I'll say in terms of if you want to make your products more accessible, or you want to make sure that what you're bringing to your students is accessible, please join us at XR Access. We have a lot of people, we have a community that is constantly talking about this stuff and trying to improve it. You can join our Slack at bit.ly/xraccess-slack, and just talk to a lot of people who are facing the same challenges that you are. We're a community that's trying to bridge the gap between people with disabilities who need this accessibility and the people that are in the position to place it. And so we'd love to have as many voices as possible in this community of ours.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Dylan, for sharing all that information. I hope everyone really was able to grasp what he was saying, but we'll make those links also available in the chat. So Jasmine, you told this beautiful story about kind of like if you build it, they will come, but that wasn't how you shaped it. Can you talk about how you started to increase the influx of students that actually came into your makerspace,
Yeah,
even when you designed it and did an audit of how accessible it was?
of course. So I actually created resources that were based off of this workflow. So I'm going to start from, we of course have this multidisciplinary space. Um, I accessibility is not formally in my title, but of course I do it. And when I first started, one of the things I asked was about accessibility, Section 508 compliance. It was crickets. Everybody was very like, And one of the things I heard was, we haven't had anybody request accommodations, i.e. haven't had disabled patrons request them. So therefore, and it wasn't me, of course, with ill intention, but what I ended up doing was saying, okay, well, we have multiple points that have to be addressed. This goes back to Anna's original point. Not only do we have to make sure that the technology and resources are accessible, we have to make sure that the people supporting the services have knowledge on how to support. So have a notepad and pen on hand in case someone is deaf or hard of hearing. what do you do? How to guide someone who, as a sighted person who may have low vision or may need assistance in a new space? A bunch of sensory sensitivities. How do we, how just preparing people who provide those services. Then on top of that, we needed to have regular annual audits going on. And I'm the only accessibility person, so I have to start training other people to start auditing the space on their own. And then we have to make sure that we're actually doing outreach and making sure that we're consistently reevaluating our services. So when I remember one day it happened right before COVID, our graduate student came to me. He's like, by the way, I forgot to tell you, we started having this influx of deaf students. We did all this stuff. He's like, actually a couple of blind students. And what struck me was not only had we increased the influx of students using these resources because they understood they could use them, but he had been trained so comfortably to provide services that he forgot to tell me. He was like, yeah, I've been providing them services. It's fine. I kept a notepad on hand. We figured it out. Everything was fine. We had some snafus, but we got through it and everything was fine. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. And that whole workflow that I'm talking about, I'm building out further for our XR studio, our immersive studio. And I created, as part of the DLF Teach Toolkit, 3 separate resources that all go together. There is a basic overview and intro into disability and accessibility, as well as some readings and just some things to consider as an educator. Do you need to think about IEPs, alternative access plans, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a basic auditing checklist for people who are not accessibility specialists, who cannot recognize, a web content accessibility guideline for their life, who are just reading through to help them process to get them started on recognizing potential accessibility barriers. And then there's a guideline to help educators develop equally effective alternative access plans, which are administrative documents that not only record what the barrier to access was, but what the plan to repair it is, who's in charge of repairing it, how to contact them, and what the turnaround time for doing so is. So if there's accountability and all parties involved, there's transparency. So you know who's responsible for what. Students can advocate for themselves, educators can advocate, and everybody's there. And so I kind of have documents that are supposed to take what I did in my space, but do that, more generally. And that's becoming an automatic auditing process for our XR experiences. That checklist is gradually going to turn into a form that student workers, user testing coming, will be able to do with no assistance, have just a manual, and be able to produce these audits that then could be shared, reused, updated annually. The alternative access plans have actually already been reused once without me knowing about it, so it worked. Educators saw it, took it, and they said, great, I'm just going to reuse this. And now it's normalized to have accessibility documentation with educators who have no background or no familiarity with accessibility. So that's all of that. Those links are in the chat for the documents that kind of ground it.
Okay, so we're just about at time, and I want to thank all of my panelists, Jasmine, Dylan, and Anna, for participating in this robust conversation about how we can make education with XR inclusive for all. And I know that we do all of the things that we do because humanity simply can't wait. Please visit Unite the Metaverse. My company, Metaverse United, will help you also find where you belong in the embodiment of the internet called the Metaverse. And I am grateful and humbled to have been able to moderate this panel. Thank you, Karen and Julie. I appreciate you all. Take care.
Thank you so very much, Muhsinah, Dr. Morris, and Jasmine and Dylan. We're really grateful to you for sharing your time. We have so much to do in this space. There's a lot of work.
It's so important too. It's so important because
we can do it. Like we have the people.
No reason not to, right?
Yeah.
And that is a perfect segue into our next conversation about governance.